Week 10 Voting and Turnout. So, we are going to start to take a turn from institutions to behavior in American politics and government, and the first step in that is looking at voting and turnout. So, we have an odd institution of voting compared to other countries because there are elements of federal government control and elements of state government control. So the federal government sets the floor, what is absolutely necessary for due process and certain qualifications for certain federal offices. Everything else is the state government's domain. So where elections will be held, when, in cases other than national elections, they'll be held. So for things like school board and whatnot, they don't have to be held in the first Tuesday in November. What type of ballot is used, etc. And so this creates a tension between national parity or equality amongst the states and states' rights. And what we see from that is the way in which our institution of voting has grown over time. So pre-Civil War, voting was limited to white, male, landowning, upper-class men. And sometimes, in certain areas, Christians were part of that as well. So that was the list of qualifications, but they were not uniform from state to state. And the voting reforms first started because someone was angry, and that person is President Andrew Jackson. But he wasn't president at this time. So what this video will show us is what happened in the 1824 election that is sometimes called the corrupt bargain.
For the second time in history, an election had to be decided by the House of Representatives. With Clay eliminated, the House had to decide between Adams, Crawford, and Jackson. Clay wanted to be Secretary of State. He approached Jackson and offered to help Jackson be elected if Clay was appointed Secretary of State. Jackson's reply was to state, "Before I would reach the presidential chair by such means, I would see the earth open up and swallow both Mr. Clay and his friends and myself with them." On January 9th, Clay dined with Adams, and an arrangement was reached. Clay would be Secretary of State, and in return he would support Adams. Clay's support did not guarantee Adams' election. It would all be decided on the floor of the House. It was a cold and clear day in Washington on February 9th, the day that Congress was to convene to pick a president. In the election in the House of Representatives, each state had one vote. With 24 states in the Union, it would take 13 votes to elect a president. Adams started with 9 states, and Daniel Webster had convinced Maryland and Louisiana to support Adams. That left Adams 2 states short for an all-important first ballot victory. Without one, Adams supporters felt that the momentum would move to Jackson, who had won more popular votes. Clay worked hard on wavering states, and before the votes began, Missouri announced for Adams. New York was the last to vote, and at the last moment it voted for Adams.
So in a tied race, essentially a three-way race, once Clay dropped out and threw his support to John Quincy Adams, we have Andrew Jackson not receiving the presidency despite the fact that he had more popular votes than any other candidate. And this angered Andrew Jackson, and one can see why. And so he started a set of reforms to reform the institution, primarily to take out that land-owning requirement. What Andrew Jackson noticed is that the states that he lost electorally, he would have won if people were not required to own land as part of the requirements to vote. So that still white male individuals, but take out the landowning requirement, and he had a lot more popularity. So between the 1824 and 1828 election, he worked on getting these laws changed in certain states. And by 1828, he had enough states changed that he was able to win the presidency outright without having to resort to a House of Representatives vote. So the next major shift was after the Civil War. The Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, are typically called the Civil War Amendments, came after the Civil War ended, and they as you can see here, did three things: make slavery unconstitutional, provided due process and equal protection enforceable against the states. Also, some other things. The 14th Amendment is pretty complicated. And then the 15th Amendment provided that the right to vote shall not be abridged based on race or color. However, what you see on the right side of the screen is important because the amendment said you can't take away someone's right to vote based on race or color does not necessarily mean that people were allowed to vote who were black. And so you have practices like poll taxes, which is the top part, and literacy tests, which is the bottom part, that were disproportionately used against African Americans. And even though many poor white people would not be able to either pay the poll tax or pass the literacy test, they were exempted from these things under grandfather clauses. And these grandfather clauses said that if your grandfather was able to vote, then you did not have to go through essentially these hoops. You didn't have to jump through these hoops, pay the poll tax, do the literacy test. Well, since African Americans did not have grandfathers who were able to vote at this point in time, or who did vote, you did not see this. So they were disproportionately affected by poll taxes and literacy tests, and that was the intent, really, was to try and find ways in which to keep them from voting. This was primarily done in the South, but not exclusively done in the South. But it did tend to follow the pattern of states that had slavery at the time of the Civil War. So the 20th century saw a few changes. First, in 1920, the 19th Amendment took effect that said that the right to vote could not be abridged on the basis of sex. And actually, so what you see here in that photo here is a meme that went around with suffragettes calling on President Wilson to give women the right to vote, and they eventually had to pass a constitutional amendment for that. And then in 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed in an attempt to do away with practices like poll taxes, like literacy tests, and grandfather clauses. So it had two general provisions. One was to outlaw these practices that they knew were taking place. Two was to make states that had a history of using these practices, and typically histories of slavery, had to submit proposed changes in voting rules to the federal government. This was called pre-clearance. So Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, if they wanted to change qualifications to vote or methods of voting, they had to go to the federal government and get pre-clearance. And this stood for 48 years. In 2013, there was a case called Shelby County versus Holder, in which the Supreme Court said we no longer need the pre-clearance part of the law. This case, though, was decided over the strenuous objection and dissent of 4 of the justices on the court, and if this balance on the court were to change, you can see how the case would go another way. Finally, the 26th Amendment in 1971 allowed people nationwide the right to vote at the age of 18. Some states started at 21, but with the Vietnam War and the protests against the Vietnam War, one of the resounding refrains was that that people were being sent to die for their country who were not able to vote in their country. So the 26th Amendment was actually quickly passed. It only took a couple of years, which is much more quickly than some other amendments, to make the voting age nationwide 18. So let's look at voting today. The next few slides have statistics on them by state, by race, by age, and this isn't important for the numbers necessarily, but I want you to look at who's voting and maybe think about why that matters. So this is 2012 and 2014's turnout. 2012 was a presidential election year, so turnout is higher. 2014 was a midterm election year, meaning only congressional elections on the federal level, and so turnout is always lower, but it was the lowest of all time. As you can see, Michigan actually does pretty well in terms of turnout. It's never in the bottom half. And if you look at 2008, Michigan's actually in the upper third of states in terms of voting turnout. But one interesting thing to note is that the racial divide in voting is changing. It used to be that whites turned out to vote more than any other race by percentages. After 2008, that is no longer the case. So for 2008, it was pretty much neck and neck between whites and blacks. And then in 2012, blacks turned out more than whites. And you can see some of that happening between Latinos or Hispanics and Asians as well. And so when you couple this with the next slide, think about who holds the power in this country. Because what you're looking at is age. 65 and older. The people 65 and older turn out to vote more than any other age group. And so in 2012, that looked like 71%, almost 72% of that population. Whereas 18 to 24-year-olds, and many people in this class are 18 to 24, only turned out at 41.2%. So when you think about power and how power is distributed and how congressional representatives and governors and even the president thinks about who has the power in society, think about who votes, because there is a correlation between who votes and who gets government preference in certain programs. One of the common refrains is that we have had a decline in voter turnout, that since the 1960s in particular, we have just, as a country, not been exercising our voting rights the way we should. And there is some evidence that tends to agree with this statement, and you can see that here. But I want to challenge that a little bit with you for a minute, because I think it's important to understand that when people say, oh, the country's going to hell and voter turnout is one reason, that this might not necessarily be a full picture of what's going on. So it does look comparatively pretty bad to other countries. So you can see in this list, and this is for 2010 midterm elections, not a presidential year, you can see that voter turnout was pretty bad. And you can see that there are countries that are above us that we often decry as being not democratic, like Russia, or somehow less than us, like Brazil. So, this is something to be concerned about. But think about why we don't vote. And compare it with these other countries and just think about the situations in general. If you look at institutional barriers, the basic idea is that we have very high institutional barriers and very low institutional incentives. So let me break this down. The election day for federal elections is on a Tuesday in November. This is not a national holiday, so a lot of people do have to work. Most people do have to work. And November is not exactly predictable when it comes to weather. Furthermore, transportation to and from the polls can be difficult, both in urban areas and in rural areas where you have to travel quite a distance to go vote. Which means time can be a factor. And if time is a factor, that's going to disproportionately affect people who have less economic means, people who are hourly workers, who taking an hour away from work really does matter. It's not just a matter of leaving early, skipping your lunch, it's a matter of taking money out of your pocket. Knowledge. Voting requires some knowledge, and some people just don't feel confident or knowledgeable in their choices, and so they do not vote. We have more elections, so the frequency of elections is an issue. We have more elections than other countries have, and so there is less of an incentive to participate when they are so frequent. And one thing that your book notes, I'm not exactly entirely bought into this theory, that because jury duty rules are based on voter registration, people don't register to vote because they don't want to serve jury duty. I don't find this entirely persuasive. I don't think many people think of that when they register to vote or don't register to vote. But it is a potential barrier that's institutional. Unlike these other countries, like Brazil, that actually has a fine for not voting, there is no compulsory incentive, either a penalty for not voting or a reward for voting. that would encourage people to vote. And many countries use a penalty and reward system, whether it be on taxes or a fine or something like that. There's no meaningful party competition. There are safe seats, so you know if you live in certain areas that the Democrat's going to win or the Republican's going to win. So it seems like a waste to vote. And there is no societal pressure to vote that really encourages participation. Most people don't feel societally encouraged to vote or shunned if they don't vote. And other societies do have that mentality. There are also some social and psychological barriers. One theory, the rational voter theory, which we'll come back to next week when we talk about voting choice, says that not voting is actually the rational thing to do. If you were to do a cost-benefit analysis of voting, it would not be a savvy decision to vote. It costs more than the benefit you get from it. There is no social benefit that rises to the level of the costs. So rational voter theory says it's actually rational to not vote, and so that people that don't vote are doing the right thing. There's also social and psychological theories that, for example, people who have strong ties to a party are more likely to vote because they're more informed and engaged citizens. Also that people who have a higher socioeconomic status are more likely to vote, in part because the barriers are higher at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, but also because there's more of a culture of voting amongst high socioeconomic status voters. And then there are some group consciousness theories that if you belong to a certain group and the election is particularly relevant to that group, think black voting turnout in 2008 for Barack Obama, that this will provide an incentive to go vote to you. But there has to be group cohesion for this to work. You have to actually believe that that's part of your identity. This does not work, for example, amongst women across all races and ages. There's no cohesive group. But there are smaller cohesive voting blocks that this would tend to work for. So, one final thing in answering that question of why we don't vote is to look at the possibility that maybe we do better than is being said. So one of the problems that a couple of researchers found was that we are looking at voting turnout in the wrong way. What is usually used for voting turnout measures is what's called the voting age population, VAP, voting age population. And that is the number of people over 18 who would be eligible to vote because of citizenship, right? So all the citizens over 18 by census data. So that, in the 1960s makes a lot of sense. But we've had a lot of disenfranchisement within our society over time. And so voting eligible population, the number of people allowed to vote in elections, is actually a better measure. So felons, for example, are not able to vote in most states. But we were still counting them as part of the voting population. So what you see at the bottom is changing that equation. So the number of ballots cast divided by VAP is going to give you a lower percentage, especially in modern times, than voting eligible population. So this chart here on the right shows you that if you measure the voting eligible population, which is the green line, we are doing actually a lot better than voting age population would suggest. Now, you can see here that that's the difference between about 58% and about 62%, but that's 5 percentage points. And if you go back to where some of the voting records were in the 50s and 60s, that's actually on par with what people say is should be happening. So the question, why don't we vote, can be answered a multitude of ways, including maybe we do vote. So current issues in voting, let's stick with voter turnout for a minute. One question is low voter turnout a problem? If we buy into the voting age population statistics, or if we even look at the voting eligible population statistics and say this is still too low, what does that mean about our nation? Does that mean we don't believe in democracy? Does it undermine our strength, especially when we're saying other countries should be like we are? One other current issue in voting bears mentioning, and that is the idea of voter ID laws. Voter ID laws are laws like we have in the state of Michigan now that require you to show ID at the polling place. These laws are fairly new. It used to be that you did not have to show identification at the polling place. Proponents of the laws say it's a good way to fight fraud at the voting place. That if you have to produce ID, they can say this is or is not you, and so you can't vote. But opponents of these laws say that would be okay, except there's actually very few cases. In fact, most states have one, maybe two historical cases of polling place fraud that this would even attempt to prevent. And so, really, if you're an opponent of these laws, you're probably going to claim that these are a form of restricting the right to vote. Think about the people that don't typically have a driver's license or even a current state ID. These are typically people who are poor, disproportionately African American, Native American, and Latino. They are people who do not vote in certain races, so these are maybe lower information voters, and they are typically Democratic voters. And most of the laws that have been passed by Republican majorities in states. So there are many people who say that this is not, a mere coincidence, but this is a design, that these are designed to get people to not vote. But then there are other people who say if this is, one of our most fundamental civic duties, shouldn't we protect it with everything we have? So that's an issue you'll have to parse out on your own, but I wanted to at least reference it because it is such a current issue in voting and voting law. So our supplemental reading this week is by Michael Sandel. And Michael Sandel, his overall idea is that we need to return to some of these Republican virtues of civic responsibility and civic duty and participation in order to have a healthy political discourse. And dealing with the 2016 presidential election, you can see why this rings somewhat true. So he says what has happened over time is that we have disconnected our political lives from our personal lives. And that this really harms our political discourse because we get disenchanted with what government can do in order to provide us a good life. So we think government cannot help or create the conditions for having a good life. And because we are disenchanted, we don't want to engage in politics, and we lose the ability to actually work in politics. We lose mastery of political ideas. It's not like riding a bike. If you have not ever dealt in politics before, you don't understand what the House should be doing, the Senate should be doing, the President should be doing. And so we feel kind of like politics is a game that just doesn't matter to us and has left us behind. This is not something that's unknown, but something we have fight in different ways depending on our political ideas. So liberals fight economically. They fight against economic forces that disenfranchise people on an economic level. Conservatives feel that this is a matter of virtues and morals, that we need to bring those back to our public political sphere. And Sandel argues that ultimately, our political system asks us to set aside our moral and political beliefs in order to be civic individuals, but then to set aside our civic side to be moral individuals. And this leads to corruption. Either we become very fundamental in our moral persuasions and we don't see any gray areas, everything's very black and white, and we don't see room for negotiation. Or we have a complete lack of virtue in our political areas, and there's nothing that's too low. And either one of these, Sandel says, is a problem, and that we need to return to connecting our personal lives with our political lives in a real and meaningful way to avoid unhealthy political discourse. And so in the course of the 2016 election, you can see why this might be an issue. If people are kind of starving for someone who speaks to them and makes them feel like they're part of the system, they're more likely to pick an extreme candidate than a moderate candidate. And that might not be a bad thing, because you could be talking in either case about someone you might like. So maybe you like Donald Trump, maybe you like Bernie Sanders. But those are candidates that are more on the extremes of their parties in the political system than have been seen in quite some time. But if you think that the system should be kept intact, that you don't need a revolution or to make America great again, then you're going to have to find a way to tell people that they aren't disenfranchised in some way. And quite frankly, that's going to be hard to do. So Sandel points to this. He's writing long before this election, but as a possibility. And in fact, I would argue that the 2016 election gives us an illustration of that. So that brings us to the end of this week. Don't forget, if you're going to do the Sandel blog, that it is up, and I can answer any questions you have via email. Talk to you soon.